the entire world thought, what a great beginning now for, a remodeling of the monarchy, to have, this prince and his wife, a divorcee, and an American, a woman of mixed.
Meghan Markle disappeared for 48 hours, and nobody could find her. It was March 2023, and Harry was frantic, calling everyone in their inner circle, checking hospitals, replaying their last conversation in his head, trying to figure out what he'd missed. Her phone was off. Her security detail had been dismissed 2 days earlier with explicit instructions not to follow. She'd taken nothing with her except her passport and a single carry-on bag. When she finally resurfaced, walking through the door of their Montecito mansion like a ghost, Harry barely recognized her. The woman who'd left had been composed, determined, still fighting. The woman who came back looked defeated in a way he'd never seen before. She'd been to Louisiana. That's all she would say at first, just those 4 words that explained nothing and everything at the same time. Harry had no idea that Meghan's maternal family had roots there, no clue that she'd been sitting on a secret so explosive that it required a pilgrimage to the source. What she found in those Louisiana parish records, buried in archives that smelled like decay and forgotten history, confirmed her worst nightmare. The story her mother had told her, the sanitized version she'd been clinging to for years, was a lie. The truth was so much worse, so fundamentally disturbing, that Meghan had spent 2 days sitting in a motel room trying to figure out if she could live with it. And now she had to decide whether Harry deserved to know, or if some secrets were better left buried, even if they were slowly poisoning everything she touched. Louisiana's parish records tell stories that official documents elsewhere won't. In the antebellum South and the decades that followed, mixed-race families, covert relationships, and complicated bloodlines were facts of life that got recorded in church registries and county files, even when they were socially unacceptable. Meghan arrived in Ascension Parish on a humid Tuesday morning, checking into a roadside motel under a fake name. She'd rented a car at the airport using a credit card linked to a shell company, taking precautions that felt paranoid but necessary. If the media caught wind of this trip, if anyone figured out what she was looking for, the scandal would break before she had a chance to control it. The parish clerk's office was a tired building that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s, with fluorescent lights that buzzed and file cabinets that probably predated computers. The woman behind the desk barely looked up when Meghan asked about genealogical records from the 1940s and 1950s. She just pointed to a back room filled with boxes and ledgers and told her she had until 5 o'clock. What Meghan found in those dusty records rewrote everything she thought she knew about her family. Her great-grandmother, the woman whose name appeared on some documents as Janet Arnold and on others as Janet Ragland, had a history that explained why the family had always been so secretive, why they'd moved so frequently, why entire branches of the family tree seemed to vanish whenever anyone looked too closely. Janet had been born in rural Louisiana in 1934, the daughter of a woman named Claudette and a man whose identity changed depending on which record you consulted. But the DNA tests that Meghan's genealogist had run, combined with the parish records now spread across the table in front of her, told a story that made Meghan physically ill. Claudette hadn't just had a relationship with a relative, she'd been involved with her own father in a situation that the records hinted was less consensual than anyone wanted to acknowledge. The language was coded, the way these things always were in official documents from that era, but the truth was unmistakable once you knew how to read between the lines. The implications were staggering. Janet Arnold, Meghan's maternal grandmother, was the product of generational abuse that had been covered up and reframed as just another complicated family situation. The trauma of that origin had shaped Janet's entire life, driving her north to Ohio, where she reinvented herself, changed her story, and tried to create a clean break from the past. She married young, had Doria, and died before Meghan was born, taking most of her secrets to the grave. But genetics don't lie, and the DNA markers that showed up in modern testing revealed patterns that couldn't be explained by normal family relationships. When Meghan's genealogist ran the numbers, the results were conclusive. The level of genetic overlap in Meghan's maternal line indicated inbreeding within 2 generations. It wasn't something that could be dismissed as a distant connection or a coincidence. It was recent, it was direct, and it was documented in records that anyone with enough motivation could eventually find. Meghan spent 6 hours in that records room, photographing documents with shaking hands, trying to process information that fundamentally changed her understanding of herself. She wasn't just the descendant of slaves and freedmen navigating post-Civil War America, which would have been a powerful but uncomplicated narrative. She was the product of a family destroyed by abuse and secrecy, carrying genetic evidence of trauma that went back generations. The fairy tale she'd told herself about her ancestry, the dignified story of hardworking Black Americans building better lives for their children, had a rot at its core that couldn't be ignored. And she'd married into a family obsessed with bloodlines and genetic purity, a family that had spent centuries carefully managing their lineage to avoid exactly this kind of scandal. The cruel irony wasn't lost on her. She'd been judged by the royals and the British public for being American, for being divorced, for being biracial, but none of those criticisms compared to what would happen if this information became public.
That first night in Louisiana, Meghan sat in her motel room and considered her options. She could destroy the documents she'd photographed, pretend she'd never found them, and hope that nobody else ever went digging as deep as her genealogist had. But that felt impossible now that she knew. The knowledge was inside her, changing how she saw herself and her mother and her children. Or she could come clean, tell Harry everything, and hope that their relationship was strong enough to survive the revelation. But that meant trusting that he wouldn't see her differently, wouldn't look at their children and wonder about genetic damage, wouldn't resent her for bringing this into the royal bloodline. The third option was the one that terrified her most. Someone else could find these records, someone with less noble intentions, and the story could break without her having any control over the narrative. That's what finally drove her back to California. The realization that silence wasn't protection. It was just delayed detonation. When Harry finally got the full story out of her, 3 days after she returned, his reaction was worse than she'd imagined. It wasn't anger or disgust, which she could have fought against. It was pity. And underneath that, a calculation she'd never seen in his eyes before. He was doing math, figuring out what this meant for their brand, their deals, their carefully constructed image as victims of institutional racism who'd escaped to build a better life. This revelation complicated that narrative in ways that made it almost unusable. They'd positioned themselves as targets of unfair scrutiny and prejudice, but now Harry was looking at evidence that maybe some of that scrutiny had been warranted, that the palace investigators who'd flagged concerns about Meghan's background hadn't been operating purely from racism, but from information they'd uncovered. It didn't excuse the treatment Meghan had received, but it added layers of complexity that their supporters wouldn't want to acknowledge, and their critics would weaponize mercilessly.
The argument that followed lasted through the night and into the next morning. Harry felt betrayed, not just by Meghan's secrecy, but by how the revelation recontextualized every conflict they'd had with the royal family. He'd been so certain that they were the villains, that every concern raised about Meghan was rooted in prejudice and institutional cruelty. Now he had to consider that maybe they'd known about this Louisiana nightmare, that maybe their hesitation about fully embracing Meghan had been based on information he hadn't been privy to. It made him feel manipulated from both sides, used by Meghan, who'd kept this from him, and managed by his family, who'd let him marry into a genetic scandal without proper warning. The paranoia that had defined his adult life, the certainty that the institution was always scheming against him, now extended to his wife. Who else knew? Who else had been keeping this from him? How many people had been sitting on this information, waiting for the right moment to deploy it? Meghan's defense was that she'd been protecting all of them, that revealing the truth about her ancestry would have destroyed everything before they'd had a chance to build something real. She argued that the past didn't define them, that what mattered was the family they were creating and the values they were teaching their children. But Harry couldn't get past the deception. He'd left his country, his military career, his relationship with his brother, all because he believed Meghan when she said they were being unfairly persecuted. Now he had to wonder if some of that persecution had been justified, if the concerns raised about their relationship had been more legitimate than he'd wanted to admit. The foundation of trust that a marriage requires had cracks running through it now, and neither of them knew if it could be repaired. The practical implications were just as devastating as the emotional ones. They'd signed deals worth millions based on their story of escaping oppression and building a new life. Netflix, Spotify, and various publishing houses had invested in the narrative of two people fighting against institutional racism and winning. But this Louisiana revelation changed the story in ways that made it less marketable and more complicated. Meghan wasn't just a biracial American actress who'd been mistreated by stuffy British royals. She was a woman carrying genetic evidence of family trauma so severe that it threatened the legitimacy of her children's place in the line of succession. That's not a story that streaming platforms want to tell. And it's not one that generates sympathy and support from audiences. It generates scandal and speculation and the kind of attention that destroys careers rather than building them. The children became the central concern in every conversation. Archie and Lilibet carried the genetic markers that told the story, and as DNA testing became more common and databases more comprehensive, the likelihood that their ancestry would become public knowledge increased exponentially. Every relative who uploaded their DNA to a genealogy website was another potential leak. Every distant cousin doing recreational ancestry research was another threat. Meghan and Harry had to decide how to protect their children from information that could define and damage them, while also preparing them for the possibility that the secret would eventually emerge. It was an impossible situation, made worse by the fact that they couldn't control the narrative or manage the timing. The truth was sitting in parish records in Louisiana, in genealogical databases online, in DNA markers that couldn't be hidden or explained away. It was just a matter of time before someone connected the dots and published their findings.
The palace had known, of course. That became clear when Harry finally confronted his father's private secretary about what investigators had uncovered before the wedding. They'd found the Louisiana records, they'd seen the DNA analysis, and they'd made a calculated decision about how to handle it. The strategy had been containment. Allow the marriage to proceed, keep Meghan's maternal family at a distance, and maintain plausible deniability if the story ever broke. They could claim they'd done due diligence, but found nothing conclusive, that American records from that era were notoriously incomplete, that they'd relied on Meghan's own representations about her family history. It was a masterclass in institutional ass-covering, protecting the monarchy while setting up Meghan to take the fall if necessary. And they'd never told Harry the full truth because they knew he'd react emotionally rather than strategically. They'd managed him the way they'd always managed him, keeping him in the dark for his own good and for the good of the institution. That betrayal, the realization that his own family had known and hidden this from him, pushed Harry into a depression that those close to him described as worse than anything following his mother's death. He'd spent his entire adult life feeling like the institution was working against him, but he'd always assumed his father, despite all his flaws, had his best interests at heart. Now he had to confront the reality that Charles had signed off on letting him marry someone while withholding critical information about her background. It wasn't protection, it was manipulation, and it confirmed every paranoid suspicion Harry had harbored about how the royal family operated. They didn't see him as a son or a brother, they saw him as an asset to be managed, a potential problem to be controlled. And when he became more trouble than he was worth, they had insurance in the form of Meghan's genealogical nightmare, information they could leak if he ever became too much of a threat to the institution. Meghan's behavior in the months following her Louisiana trip and the subsequent confrontation with Harry became increasingly erratic. Friends noticed that she seemed manic, taking meetings and pursuing projects with a desperation that didn't match her usual calculated approach. She was trying to build something, anything, that would matter more than the scandal waiting to break. If she could become successful enough, influential enough, beloved enough, maybe the revelation about her ancestry would be survivable. It was the same logic that had driven her entire adult life,
the belief that achievement and image could overcome any obstacle. But this was different. This wasn't bad reviews or tabloid criticism or even racism, though all of those things had been real and painful. This was genetic evidence of family trauma that contradicted the carefully constructed narrative she'd built about who she was and where she came from. The podcast that launched in 2023, the various business ventures, the attempts to break into politics and activism, all of it reads differently when you understand what Meghan was running from. She wasn't just building a post-royal career. She was trying to establish enough credibility and goodwill that she could survive the eventual exposure of her family's secret. Every interview where she talked about empowerment and authenticity had a layer of irony that would become devastating once people knew what she'd been hiding. She'd positioned herself as someone who overcome obstacles through determination and honesty. But the foundation of that image was built on omission and carefully managed revelations. The cognitive dissonance was eating her alive. The stress of maintaining multiple versions of truth depending on who she was talking to and what they needed to hear. Harry, meanwhile, retreated further from public life, his rare appearances marked by a haunted quality that went beyond homesickness or family estrangement. He was a man grappling with multiple betrayals simultaneously, trying to reconcile his love for his wife with his anger at her deception, while also processing his family's manipulation and the destruction of the narrative he'd built his entire post-royal life around. The memoir he'd published, the interviews he'd given, all of it would look different if this Louisiana secret became public. He'd painted himself as the hero of a love story, the prince who'd sacrificed everything for the woman he loved. But if that woman had been lying to him from the beginning, if the persecution he'd attributed to racism was actually rooted in legitimate concerns about her background, then his entire story collapsed. He wasn't a hero, he was a fool, and the world would take great pleasure in pointing that out. The breaking point came in late 2024 when a genealogist, unconnected to the royal family or to Meghan, published a paper tracing genetic patterns in African-American families from the post-Civil War South. It wasn't specifically about Meghan, but it included data from the same Louisiana parishes where her ancestors had lived. The genetic markers discussed in the paper matched patterns that would show up in Meghan's own DNA, and it was only a matter of time before someone made the connection. When Meghan's legal team reached out to try to prevent publication, they just drew more attention to the issue. Suddenly, genealogists and journalists were asking why the Duchess of Sussex was so concerned about an academic paper that didn't mention her by name. The Streisand effect kicked in, and what had been an obscure academic publication became a topic of speculation across social media and tabloid outlets. That's when Meghan finally broke, when the careful control she'd maintained for years shattered under the weight of inevitability. Harry found her in their home office at 3 a.m, surrounded by printouts of social media posts and genealogical forums where people were starting to piece together her Louisiana connection. She was crying in a way he'd never seen. Not the performative tears that she could turn on and off for public appearances, but the kind of breakdown that comes from complete exhaustion and hopelessness. She told him she couldn't do it anymore, couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when she knew that any day someone would publish the full story and their lives would implode. She talked about wanting to disappear, about wishing she'd never married into the royal family, about regretting that her children would grow up defined by something that happened generations before they were born. Harry's response to that breakdown was complicated. Part of him wanted to comfort her, to promise that they'd get through it together. But another part was still angry, still processing his own betrayal, still uncertain whether the marriage could survive under the weight of this much deception and trauma. He did what he'd been trained to do from childhood. He managed the situation. He called their lawyers, their PR team, their security consultants. He started building a strategy for when, not if, the story broke. And in doing that, he became exactly what he'd always claimed to hate. Someone who prioritized damage control over emotional honesty. someone who saw relationships in terms of risk management rather than human connection. Meghan had wanted a partner who would love her unconditionally, and what she got in that moment was a royal doing triage. And the disappointment in her eyes told Harry more than any words could have.
The strategy they eventually agreed on was imperfect, but necessary. They would get ahead of the story by releasing their own carefully worded statement acknowledging that Meghan's maternal ancestry included some complicated family situations, as was common for many Black American families in the post-Civil War South. They would frame it as a story of survival and resilience, people making impossible choices in impossible circumstances. They would not provide specific details, and they would threaten legal action against anyone who published the more salacious aspects without proof. It was a gamble, hoping that vague acknowledgement would satisfy curiosity without providing enough concrete information to fuel endless speculation. But they both knew it was a temporary solution at best. Once people started looking, once genealogists and journalists had a direction to search, the Louisiana records would be found. The DNA evidence would be analyzed. The full story would emerge, and no amount of spin would make it palatable. The real question was whether their marriage could survive in the meantime. Trust, once broken at this level, doesn't repair easily. Harry knew that Meghan had lied to him, not necessarily through direct falsehood, but through omission, through allowing him to believe a version of her history that was sanitized and incomplete. Meghan knew that Harry now saw her differently, that when he looked at her, he was doing calculations about genetics and scandal, rather than just seeing the woman he loved. They were staying together for the children, for the brand, for the investments that depended on them remaining a couple. But the love that had driven Harry to leave his country and his family was damaged in ways that might be irreparable. They'd become business partners managing a crisis rather than spouses building a life together. And both of them grieved for what they'd lost.
The children represented both the hope and the tragedy of the situation. Archie and Lilibet were innocent, beautiful kids who had no responsibility for the choices their ancestors made or the secrets their mother kept. But they would live with the consequences anyway. Their genetic heritage would be discussed and dissected by people who'd never meet them. Their place in the royal line of succession would be questioned not because of who they were, but because of what their DNA revealed about where they came from. Meghan and Harry tried to protect them from that knowledge as long as possible, but they knew that eventually they'd have to explain why their family history was different, why people said cruel things about their ancestry, why their maternal great-great-grandmother's story was something shameful rather than just sad. It was a conversation neither parent wanted to have, but one they couldn't avoid forever. The broader implications for discussions about race and the royal family were significant, but largely unexamined. Meghan had become a symbol for many people, representing progress and inclusivity and the modernization of an ancient institution. But this Louisiana revelation complicated that symbolism in ways that made everyone uncomfortable. It brought up questions about how we judge people for their ancestry, about what genetic testing means for privacy and identity, about the difference between being a victim of racism and being rejected for documented family scandal. Those questions didn't have easy answers, and most people didn't want to wrestle with them. It was simpler to remain in camps, either defending Meghan as a victim of persecution or attacking her as a manipulative social climber. The truth, as always, was more complicated than either narrative allowed.
What's become clear is that there are no winners in this situation. Meghan is trapped by a secret that was never really hers to keep, suffering consequences for choices made by people who died before she was born. Harry is caught between his love for his wife and his anger at her deception, between his hatred of his family's manipulation and his growing understanding that maybe they'd had legitimate concerns. The children will grow up defined by genetics and genealogy in ways that have nothing to do with their character or their choices. And the royal family continues operating as it always has, protecting the institution above all else, sitting on information it can deploy whenever necessary to maintain control. The cycle of secrets and damage continues, just with new players and new variations on old patterns. If Meghan had been honest from the beginning, if she'd trusted Harry with the truth about her Louisiana ancestry before they got engaged, maybe things would be different. Maybe he would have married her anyway, eyes open to the complications. Maybe they could have faced the scandal together as a unified front rather than as partners who'd betrayed each other. Or maybe the relationship would have ended, and Meghan would have been spared the nightmare of the past few years, while Harry avoided the destruction of his carefully constructed narrative. There's no way to know now. The choices were made, the secrets were kept, and the consequences are playing out in real time. All that's left is damage control, and the hope that when the full story finally breaks, there's enough goodwill and enough distraction that it doesn't completely destroy what remains of their lives. But hope isn't a strategy, and in the world of royal scandal and media feeding frenzies, it's rarely enough to make a difference.